Hi, this is your pre-reading lecture for our reading about the Bracero program by Ngai. So we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of migrant labor and how it relates to conceptions of personhood and one's own power and value. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the development of agriculture and migrant labor in California, and an overview of the farm worker strikes of the 1930s so that we know what's going on in California in terms of agriculture prior to the 1940s when the Bracero program, which you all will read about, takes shape. And then we'll take a moment to talk a little bit about how migrant laborers are represented in photography. Okay, so after the First World War is when we really begin to see the development of industrial agriculture in the American Southwest, so including Texas, Arizona, and California. And California in particular began to be a place where the factory farm, the large-scale farm, became the most prevalent form of agriculture taking place in the state. So by 1929, 37% of America's large-scale farms are here in California, and that number continues to rise throughout the 20th century. So with the rise in industrial agriculture and the decline in like the family farmer, family-run farms, we see agriculture developing into not subsistence, so not just feeding yourself and your family, but into big business. And if we know anything about the structure of California's economy, agriculture is still a giant part of that. So we should understand it and figure out how it came to be in the form that it is today. Okay, so what we are seeing here is that instead of thinking about the farmer as a landowning person who works their land, what we are thinking about here is this idea of agribusiness, or the idea of the farm as a factory. And that is a completely way of both thinking about the work of maintaining a farm, a different way of thinking about who does that work, and a different way of thinking about the value of the land as well. So agribusiness in particular in its development in California is dependent on a migrant labor model, which you all will read more about. But just to get us to brass tacks what we mean by migrant labor so we know what's going on when we jump into Nagai's chapter. So workers are seasonally employed and move from region to region. And there's a certain assumption that migrant workers don't put down roots. And as our chapter will get into, that is often a false assumption. And a film that we're going to screen a little bit later on also gives us insight into the community building practices among those that are labeled as quote-unquote migrant. Okay, so our chapters gets into what is the impact of labeling a particular group of workers or community as migrant. What does that do to their stake and their seat at the table? What happens to a community when it gets labeled as migrant in terms of their access to issues around public resources and public space? So what we're going to see is how the Bracero program views agricultural labor as inherently migrant, as something that is done by communities that are always on the move. So keeping that in mind will be crucial as we're thinking about the shape that the Bracero program takes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the 1930s in agriculture. So with the rise of factory farming and with the rise of this conception of agribusiness, we have this sense that large-scale farm owners are interested in making lots of money. So they don't have the same sort of relationship to their land, to their products, but rather see agriculture as a money-making enterprise. And so there's a desire to sort of have total control over the workforce, over this migrant workforce. So despite the fact that we see these kind of large and powerful agribusiness interests and farm owners exerting a lot of power, what we also see is the declaration of the dignity and value of workers for themselves by going on strike. So throughout the 1930s, there were tons of agricultural labor strikes right here in El Monte, not too far away. Berry pickers went on strike in 1933. In 1936, there was a huge strike in Orange County of citrus workers going on strike near Anaheim. So when we're thinking about labor, which we'll be talking about throughout the week, we want to sort of reflect on, why does someone go on strike? In order to declare their dignity, to declare their value, to recognize your own power as a worker. So it sends a message to the employer that you see yourself as valuable and that you see yourself as deserving of more, whether it's better working conditions, better labor, and the recognition of the dignity of the work that they do. So we see this kind of manifestation of a declaration of one's own value in the form of going on strike, and the recognition of one's own power in terms of you are the muscle that makes agribusiness profitable. And so if you stop work, it is a pretty big statement. And so in the 1930s, what we see happening is a major backlash to these folks that are declaring their own value and demanding better wages and better working conditions. We see a really violent response, particularly in the case of the Orange County citrus strike that I talked about a moment ago. And again, these are just a few examples from our own backyard to give us a sense of what was going on in the 30s in California. So the kind of nickname for the response to the citrus worker strikes was gun-kissed roses. So we're probably familiar with sun-kissed roses. So this is a play on that, a rather morbid play on that term. So we saw the fact that law enforcement and farm owners essentially collaborated to put down these strikes. And so this is a quote from Carrie McWilliams, who is an author who I'll talk about in a moment, describing what happened in Orange County. One of the toughest exhibitions of vigilantism that California has witnessed in many a day, under the direction of Sheriff Logan Jackson, who should long be remembered for his brutality in this strike. Over 400 special guards armed to the hilt are conducting a terrorist campaign of unparalleled ugliness. So we see this response to workers declaring their dignity, declaring their value, and demanding better working conditions and pay being responded to with a shoot-to-kill order, right? This is from the Santa Ana Register. This is the front page of the newspaper from 1936 after these folks went on strike. So we want to sort of keep in mind the perils that people faced in declaring their own value, and the way that farm owners would seek out the cooperation of local law enforcement in order to help put down potential strikes. Okay. So when we're thinking about what's happening more broadly in California in the 1930s, we're probably familiar with the 1930s being marked by the Great Depression, right, with the crash of the stock market in 1929. So we're seeing this extreme sort of worker orientation in politics taking shape in the 1930s, because there is a sense that it was, right, the business people and the fat cats who run the banks who got us into this trouble in the first place. So alongside tons of worker-led strikes that are happening throughout California, we also begin to see a shift in electoral politics around this emphasis on, well, who are actually the kind of essential workers who keep the economy alive and keep us fed, who are still living in poverty, right? So thinking about this idea of valuing the workers as the backbone of the United States. So this individual, Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, which was an expose about the meatpacking industry and the kind of exploitative working conditions there, he ended up running for governor in 1934, and his slogan was epic, and poverty in California, pretty straightforward and pretty appealing motto, I would say. So he did not win, as we might imagine. A lot of people benefit from there still being income inequality, and those people have a lot of political power. So his candidacy was not successful, unfortunately. But what we do see is that Sinclair's ideas were pretty influential in terms of President Roosevelt developing the New Deal, which was a set of programs he developed in response to the Great Depression, which we'll talk about a little bit more extensively later on in the semester. Okay, so, as I mentioned earlier, Carrie McWilliams is one of the first people to sort of put a spotlight onto this transformation of agriculture as this kind of pastoral, subsistence-based family business that was really just about feeding yourself and maybe selling a couple of bushels of wheat into this idea of factories in the field. And so if agriculture is a factory in the field, then there needs to be a regulation of working conditions just as are beginning to develop in industrial factories during this era with the rise of the power of the labor union during this moment. And additionally, we may have read John Steinbeck perhaps in high school. Grapes of Wrath and Factories in the Field were both published in 1939, and they focus on the specific hardships that are experienced by migrant agricultural workers. So there's a lot of sort of consciousness around these issues in California at this particular moment. Okay, so if we're thinking about beyond literature, beyond books, beyond fiction, if we're talking about the way that we see and view migrant laborers, the image that we're looking at here, which is from the 1940s, is very typical of how we see farm workers being represented in media. So in newspapers or on television or whatever the case may be, this kind of idea of the faceless, stooped laborer. And these images don't ask us to relate to individuals based on their identity, based on their character, based on their faces, but rather we see them as laboring bodies. And that serves to, in some ways, detach us from caring about what happens to these folks. So when we're thinking about looking at images of migrant laborers, that one that I showed you guys a moment ago, that one was really hard to find, I have to say, of folks standing up and showing their faces from the 20th century. So this is something that we want to keep in mind, right? That how people are represented in media impacts the way that people who are not migrant laborers think about migrant laborers. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to alert you guys to is this use of the short-handled hoe in the context of agricultural labor. So the short-handled hoe is this really tiny tool that was used to pick crops. So growers were of the opinion that the short-handled hoe made people work more carefully and kept crops from being damaged. But what was really useful about the short-handled hoe is that it worked as a tool of surveillance. So if you weren't stooped over using this really awkward tool, then the bosses who are overseeing work in the field could see if you weren't working, right? They could see if you were resting. And I wanted to share this short piece. It's about 7 minutes long. I'll ask you to listen to it on your own time. That gets into the impact of using a tool like this, which is mostly for the ability of a boss to surveil and not really for the quality of the work that is produced. So check that out, and we'll talk a little bit about it in our Zoom meeting this week. Okay, so as we are probably familiar with, the conditions of agricultural labor haven't changed substantially since this era in the 1930s that we've been talking about. And this summer in particular, we are faced with this issue of agricultural communities and migrant worker communities being hit hard by COVID-19 outbreaks. So the declaration of agricultural workers as essential workers means that they have to go to work, that they won't get any sort of respite from working in the fields because it's work you have to do in person, right? And a worker was quoted in this LA Times article that I've offered a link to here saying, you can't pick strawberries on Zoom, which is both funny and poignant when we're thinking about the way that migrant laborers live their lives using shared housing, using shared transportation, low wages, oftentimes no health care, and a lack of access to more generally public health resources puts this community at risk. And when we think about the counties that a lot of agricultural labor happens in, we are seeing that some of these Republican-led county governments are not always considering the lives of farm workers as they are creating mask mandates or other prevention issues around COVID as well. So I recommend that you all take a look at this article from the LA Times, and again we'll touch on it a bit when we get together for our Zoom meeting as well. So when we're studying the agricultural past, we're actually also studying the agricultural present, because the history that we're going to look at this week, including the Bracero program and our discussion of the experiences of Filipino migrant workers in the 60s at the end of the week, gives us insight into the way that some things have changed and some things have not changed. And there's one more thing I wanted to share with you all, and this is a project by Ngai Montes about representation representing the current conditions of farm workers. So thinking about how the people that feed us are sometimes homeless, the people that feed us are struggling for education and healthy communities. So this is a website for the artist Montes that I'll recommend you all check out, and I've included a few of his profiles that he's done here in the slideshow for you to read at your own time. So I'll see everybody in our Zoom meeting. Take care.